Welcome again, my friends, to the American Zarathustra Show. This is Imperium Art. I believe it's episode, I don't remember, five, six. We're here today
Four.
with four. Okay. Anyway, we're here today with Jim Bonner, a poet, writer, and brother in arms in our movement here in the white identity politics. Jim has published a play called Interbellum. Am I correct, Jim? Did I say that right?
That's correct, yes, sir.
And Jim was on. I met Jim through Conversations with the Wind, which is a poetry show by Nullis on the White Art Collective. How are you doing today, Nullis?
I'm doing fine, thank you.
Fantastic. I'm so happy to have you with us today, Jim. So Jim wrote an essay on his thoughts on Imperium Art. So we had a look at that this week, and we're very, very excited to kind of break it down and go through some of the points that he's come up with. I frankly am quite impressed with his knowledge and insight and perspective on, first of all, the arts and art history and where Imperium Art can stand in relation to that and where we could potentially move forward. So just a quick recap for someone who is not familiar with Imperium Art or this show. I strongly recommend that you go back and look at the previous episodes. They will be numbered. There'll be links below as well. So Imperium Art, in a nutshell, is a concept. Let's say that it's a name that we've given to arts that are from and for the dissident right, for white identity politics. So it's obviously something centered on white well-being, white sovereignty, white self-determination within the context of white genocide and all the crises that the white diaspora is experiencing now globally, from everywhere from South Africa to Canada to anywhere and in between. So the form creating there's so many different people creating music, poetry. Jim's created this fantastic play that he's published on Amazon, and again, we'll get a link to you below on that. We strongly urge you to purchase it. He's a phenomenal writer, really, really amazing guy too. So let's dive right in. I'm going to go over, first of all, let's let Jim introduce himself a little bit. Jim, how are you doing today?
Doing great, and frankly, I'm just really excited to be on this show. I really respect both of you guys and what y'all have done for White Art Collective, along with everything else that you've done outside of that organization. And I'm really interested about this idea that y'all have come up with, and I hope I can contribute in whatever way I can.
You already have, and this is why it's really important to get both your ideas from the essay and your play out there into the public. And our people, we need to support ourselves, each other, rather, by supporting the arts, etc. Also, just a quick plug for whiteartcollective.com. White Art Collective does shows every weekend on DLive. You can go to dlive.com/White Art Collective. Every other Sunday, Nellis has the Poetry Cast, Conversation with the Wind, which I'm happy that he lets me hang around and tag along and do some co-hosting with him on that. That's fantastic. Very enriching stuff. But tell us more about yourself, Jim, and how did you come into white identity politics?
Well, I guess you'd say I came into it the old-fashioned way or the hard way. I was raised probably like most people of our generation to be just about as anti-racist, I guess you'd say, or
Hmm.
open-minded as you could
Yeah.
possibly imagine. And when I went out into the workforce after college, I was pretty much just you know taken advantage of uh, by everyone around me. I try to help them out, do
Yeah.
good, treat them like everyone else, and they didn't feel the same way. And after a while, I wound up trying to figure out why. I read a couple of books, watched some videos, listened to some podcasts, and it just sort of it clicked. I mean, it made sense about why I was being treated differently,
Mm.
and the things that I had been raised to revere were working against my own interests. So I abandoned it and I started on a different path.
Excellent. What were some of the, I don't know, I'll just give you an example. For me, American Renaissance and Jared Taylor was my doorway into white identity politics. Was there any specific person on YouTube or a show like Red Ice TV or whatever that really helped you out?
It was, I mean, number one was Jared Taylor.
Hmm.
He's the wizard of everything. I mean, he's the great uncle,
Yes,
and
the grandfather of us all. Yes.
absolutely. And a book that American Renaissance published called "Why Race Matters"
Hmm.
by Michael Levine.
Hmm.
That book completely changed my life. It's a very
Hmm.
scientific approach to everything.
This is a major point about American Renaissance is that everything is deeply, deeply rooted in science and research. And so it's not this kind of hyper emotional, reactionary content. It's all race realism, you know. So that for our listeners or anybody new to this show, I super strongly recommend you look up Jared Taylor and American Renaissance as well. So talk to us a little bit about your book and your play. How is that, say, white art, or how is that a piece of white identity politics?
Well, the play itself, the narrative, it essentially tries to articulate the situation that I just described that I had gone through, where I essentially modernity and the way that whites have been approaching it, and the flaws with that approach. So the way that I grew up was equality, you know, be open minded, be respectful,
Hmm.
diversity is a strength, etc. And the way that that's become a complete drain on our entire civilization, and how we can actually try to, you know, work around that by mediating between a rational, more civilized side of things and a primitive, more emotional side of things, and the different characters sort of embody different mindsets and different approaches towards modernity, and how they can all come together in the end and overcome it, build something better.
Mm. Powerful. Um, so, what inspired you to create this essay on Imperium art?
Well, actually, I mean, it's Imperium Art is the same sort of mechanism that I wrote about in the play. You know, it's bringing different mindsets, different artistic people, different cultural ideas together to unify us and create something better outside of modernity, outside of that its tentacles, and make something that can stand on its own weight. So, in a way, the values that I address in my play are synonymous with the same sort of values that Imperium Art is trying to create. So
Excellent.
that drew me in from the very get go.
Mm. So there you go. You know, giving this title Imperium Art to the arts that are created by, if you will, woke white people, people that are aware of white identity politics, have had their racial awakening. Would you say that your play is a piece of Imperium Art?
I I believe that I would, and we can get into this later, but
Hmm.
I think it meets the criteria of what I've tried to lay out in the essay that would qualify it to be subsumed within the definition of Imperium Art.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, and we really, really appreciate you laying that out. I think it's going to be a good guide for in our movement. So what I've done is oh, Nellis, did you want to chime in at all? Did you have any thoughts on this?
Well, I just wanted to say hello to everybody and to Jim. And I also wanted to mention that I was introduced to Jim through Jeff Winston at the White Art Collective. Initially, Jeff contacted me about Jim. And so Jim and I started corresponding on Twitter, and we got to know each other better. And then I invited him to participate in an episode of the Conversations with the Wind Poetry Cast. And from then on, we continued to correspond. And he's also part of a little group that we have where we focus on poetry and literature, and we're trying to define thematics, context, questions, movements, things like that. And so that was simultaneous with the Imperium Art concept that you and I are working on. So both of them fit very well together in many ways. And that was pretty much it.
Well, we really have to tip our hat and thank Jeff Winston of the White Art Collective once again. He is honestly, I mean, I can't say I know anybody else who's done more for, Imperium Art, if you will, which is what we're calling it.
Yeah.
He's just a tremendous, I don't know what to say, the whirlwind of creativity and all the things that he's done for the dissident right in terms of producing positive culture that speaks to us in the crisis that we're facing. So thank you, Jeff. So what I wanted to do then is to just kind of go down some key points that I pulled out of Jim's essay. And then maybe if you guys want to respond to some of these ideas or expand on them a little bit. One looked like a very simple and concise definition of Imperium Art by Jim, which is the possibility of consolidating a unifying artistic framework for the dissident right, white identitarians, European nationalists. Would you say that's agreeable? Gentlemen?
I would agree with that.
Well, you wrote it, right? Yeah. Do you feel like there's anything more to it, though? I mean, I think that's essentially what we're talking about, though. No?
That was supposed to be like a primer definition to sort of get you in the right mindset of the general tone.
Good. It's sort of an intro to getting you started to read the essay. So
Yes.
you move on to another point here. Pro-white movements across the Western world are still trapped within the symbols, language, and imagery of liberal Enlightenment values such as progress, equality, individualism, rebellion, and material, quote, scientific truth. This is actually a really key point because this is kind of the frame of modern art, if you will, and in a sense we're smashing that frame. We're kind of according to what I'm getting from Jim in this essay is a sort of a return to pre-Enlightenment values. Is that correct, Jim?
I would agree with that completely.
Okay, so you have to kind of identify these things for starters to kind of say, where are we now in modern art, and then where do we go from here? So Jim continues, and again, these are snippets from the essay, so they're taken a little bit out of context, but they're key points. So despite this, we are still on the defensive, and perhaps, as many black-pilled people believe, we are in the throes of defeat. Why? I propose one core reason is that we have not been able to emotionally articulate the frame we desire. So that goes right back to the previous definition. What is the frame we desire? How would you guys describe that, Jim?
I would probably describe it as, well, let me scroll down here to another part in the essay to get the exact right words.
Mm-hmm.
Let me see. Okay, so here it is, a quote, creating sustainable white communities by liberating our people from the diseases of modernity. That would probably be my ultimate goal, not only in life, but through any other organization that I try to be a part of.
Mm-hmm. So the point of creating sustainable white communities is, wow, I mean, that sounds like ground zero right there. How do the arts play a role in something like that, Jim?
Well, from my point of view, the arts are essentially a tangible way of communicating culture. So music, movies, paintings, poetry, books, they're all a way of communicating a certain idea or interpretation of reality, I guess you'd say.
Mm-hmm.
What, in my opinion, what Imperium Art tries to do from my point of view is that it tries to create a culture through art, and that means that the symbols and the different images all have to be more or less shared between people, and I think that's probably the goal of art as culture creation.
Mm-hmm. So just like in our current modern times, you've got, let's say everybody's sort of literate on Star Wars culture, or even to go back into some classical, Western literature. Most people know Mark Twain, or these various kinds of things. They somehow tie an invisible thread between us all. So this is what Imperium Art does: is it's talking about themes that relate to us and our relationship to modernity and the
Yeah.
problems that we have, our relation to our enemies, the people that want to erase Western civilization. Nullis, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I actually was. I found this sentence very interesting, which is, I propose one core reason is that we have not been able to emotionally articulate the frame we desire. And I found this to be very profound
Mm,
on many different levels. It's almost like we're living in this world where we have culture. It's not like we don't have any culture.
mhm,
The question is what kind of culture we have, and then you have to start asking yourself and questioning yourself on all the different things that you were raised with
mm,
culturally.
mhm,
And so it puts you in a very difficult position when you start realizing certain subversive elements, when you start noticing certain manipulations through the arts that have been injected into our mainstream culture. And so then you have to then look in the mirror and try to figure out where you stand with the whole thing. And that's a very difficult emotional process that most people do not want to, they don't want to partake in that journey because it's a very difficult process. So a good example would be, let's say you were a big fan of a certain movie series, like Star Wars is a good
mm,
example.
mm.
And you, as a child, you enjoyed the Star Wars trilogy,
The
uh,
mythology, yeah.
and you, well, you watched the trilogy, you enjoyed the mythology, you immersed yourself in the whole thing, and then as you became older, you started to realize that there was a certain emptiness to it, and then you started to realize that the whole trope of the rebel is a liberal trope, and then you start noticing these certain things, and then you have to question almost everything that you grew up with and everything that you were taught, and that's a very difficult thing for anyone to confront. And that basically then comes to the next question, is how one can then emotionally articulate this frame, because uh, the problem is that once you realize this, you're sort of stuck in a hole because you have no alternatives to draw upon, or
Hmm.
or at least
Yeah,
you don't think you do. I mean, maybe there, I mean, there is, in my opinion, but but um, but you're stuck in this hole almost, and so
Hmm.
it's very difficult for you to find an outlet for you to emotionally articulate this frame that you crave. And I think this is a very important point that our Imperium Art should and must address.
Hmm. Jim, did you want to respond to that?
yeah, I completely agree with that. And you actually brought up an interesting point I hadn't really put into the essay or even considered in depth. But the imagery and the symbols, I'm just going to call them memes from now on. I don't really mean that in like a Pepe or any sort of
Yes,
specific.
right.
I just mean like memetics.
Mm,
The memes that we have at our disposal are essentially shared with our enemies, and they come from they're essentially side effects of modernity, and
mm,
we have to use these as weapons unless we can weaponize something like Imperium Art and make it its own frame that can, start to wash away everything else that we've been having to walk around in because we
mm.
didn't have any alternative.
Yeah. So
And
this isn't, if I could
and
just,
just yeah,
oh, go
sorry.
ahead. No, let's go ahead.
I just wanted to add that even those traditional classical cultural formulations that we've had in the past, the movements and the various epochs, even those are appropriated and twisted into a different narrative.
Mm,
And
mhm,
so we have to untangle. So not only are we confronted with modern or postmodern cultural subversion, in my opinion, but also the appropriation of our classical culture into a different context that might not necessarily fit the framework that we desire. And that's another important point.
Yeah, that's excellent. I mean, that's a really great take on that. I hadn't considered that.
So a point I wanted to make here, and this is going to come up shortly in a point on the essay, is this concept of, like, say, okay, we go back to the Star Wars analogy, that the trope of the rebel, it locks us into eternal adolescence. We're constantly, that this sort of cultural mentality of, I'm gonna rebel against authority, and that makes me cool, and kind of demonizing authority. The parallels between the Empire in Star Wars and, say, Nazi Germany. So there's so many lies about German history, and even going back farther. It's a kind of a terrible mess. And the question is, should we try to unveil those lies and set things straight, or should we kind of say that's already gone and let's start a new tropes, new memes, new narratives? What are your thoughts on that, guys? Jim, would you like to start?
Sure. Yeah, I think that would probably be essential. The point you brought up is to more or less, maybe not disregard, but for all intents and purposes, ignore everything that's going on around us, because we have the energy, we have the vitality. We're the younger generation, and everything that's coming out of Hollywood is made by the Spielbergs and everything else. And they used to be the young generation. They were the new Hollywood back in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
But they've grown into their own tropes now. They are the establishment. And so everything that's coming out of their infrastructure is it's the given. It's the what's the right word? It's the default layer. And I think that by ignoring that completely, in the same way that they tended to ignore old Hollywood, I think that we could tend to establish our own frame that would be in opposition to them, just by nature of the fact that we exist, but also by the fact that it doesn't even acknowledge that there is such a thing as a pop culture.
Mm-hmm. So one of your next points in the essay, I'm going to quote here: "Sentimentality trumps rationality. This is where we have drastically underestimated the omnipresent enemy, our lack of narratives, imagery, and symbols, which can inspire our own and allure unaware people into the community." So we were just talking about that a moment ago. Sentimentality, I find, is a very interesting thing, because Imperium Art, or art of the white dissident right, does actually have a great deal of sentimentality if you look at a lot of the memes of the 1950s, or even the kind of retro synthwave Reagan era sentimentality. These are, of course, there's other memes that look back on, say, the Roman Empire, etc. So I don't know, this is actually a really critical question, I think, for us as artists, to say, what is the role of sentimentality in Imperium art? I feel that it's kind of like a wine that you shouldn't indulge too much in. I can't. I am a very sentimental person myself, and but I mean, as far as an aspect of Imperium art, how should it be used? How would we approach that? Nullis, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that the question of sentimentality should be defined as an unapologetic approach to who we are. I don't want to sentimentalize about anything in that sense. I'm a sentimental person when it comes to certain things. I'm compassionate with my family and my loved ones. I mean, that goes without saying. But in terms of culture and in terms of the way I present my art, I'm unapologetic about it. This is who I am. This is where I come from. This is the history and the culture I draw from, draw upon. And I believe that the problem by saying, and don't get me wrong, yes, sentimentality is important. And I agree with you that it should be treated with caution. But we have to be careful that the critique that we would get from the outside is that this is nostalgic sentimentality. This is kitsch.
Mm.
This isn't serious art.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what you would get in terms of a critique. And so my response to that is, no, this is who I am.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't really care what you think is sentimental or nostalgic.
Mm.
For me, this is a part of my continuity, and I draw upon that symbolism to create a path forward for new symbolisms going forward.
Mm-hmm. And Jim, what are your thoughts on this bit that you wrote here, sentimentality trumps rationality?
Well, I tend to agree with Ellis about this one. I don't want the sentimentality to be overridden by someone's critique about, well, that's in the past. It's not the way things are anymore. But within the context of that paragraph, it was mainly to show that we had the logic on our side. Like what we were talking about before
Sure.
with the whole Jared Taylor thing. We have the
Race realism, yes.
right. We have the arguments. Everything is like that is on our side. But the reason we've lost thus far in the culture war is because we don't have any sort of emotional appeal.
Mm-hmm.
We've been more stoic about things, trying to argue rationally,
Mm-hmm.
whereas the propaganda has come in from the enemy side and
Mm-hmm.
essentially it hijacked emotions to disregard any sort of facts.
Mm-hmm.
If I can interject with that, I fully agree. Sorry, Donald.
No.
I fully agree with that, and I think that appealing to emotion is the most effective tool. And I think that maybe in that sense, yes, sentimentality, I would agree with what Jim was saying, that we do need a balance. So we have to balance our emotional spectrum.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Something that these recent riots has extremely punctuated in my mind, and I think if other people can pay attention, they would notice it too, is that trying to use science and rationality with low IQ, volatile people doesn't work. It doesn't work. When people are in a kind of fight or flight mode, you can't give them scientific data to calm them down and make them go, oh yeah, okay, I get it. I don't know why anyway, it's that way. And so, regardless of the rock of science that we have to build this movement on, all the data on DNA, the bell curve, all these various things in history, it only kind of appeals, it seems, to people who are kind of medium to high IQ that are sympathetic to even listening to it, and so like I think that is really a key point I'm trying to get down to is, people don't even want to know the truth about white identity politics. It's how do we make people sympathetic to at least listening? So perhaps the arts, Imperium Art, can have a role in that sense. So let me continue here. I'm quoting Jim's essay once again. The dichotomy of pro-individual versus anti-authority and anti-individual versus pro-authority forms the basis of all current political issues, tapping the whole social order within its false dichotomy. Before I continue, I want to let Jim expand on that a bit. Are we locked into that dichotomy? What's outside of that individuality versus authority? Jim, can you expand on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the dichotomy is being I'm pro one side and I don't like the other side. So pro individual, anti authority, that would be, if you want to look at like a political compass, it'd be the bottom of the compass, the libertarian side of the compass. And then you have anti individual, pro authority, and that would be the top side of the political compass, essentially. And I mean, there is a third way. You could be pro individual and pro authority, or you could be a fourth way, anti individual, anti authority. There's more ways than just that to operate, but because it is able to only give a half truth to each side, there's no way to fully form any sort of philosophy that could work against the system, because you're only in possession of one half of the key and you think that the other person is your enemy.
I guess I'm wondering what, in your opinion, where should we fall on that political chart? On that kind of that chart of in between these dichotomies. I have my own thoughts on it, but I want to hear your opinion on that.
Well, I would like to be as pro individual and as pro authority as possible.
Mm-hmm.
But again, something else I bring up in the essay is that individualism as a dogma is a side effect of Enlightenment values, and it's not historically represented in any other period except the modern period. So I do understand that is a breakaway from
Mm-hmm.
quote unquote tradition, but at the same time, I do feel like it has its own place
Mm-hmm.
within our sphere.
Is there any political system that is both pro-individual and pro-authority? A system where the state looks after the individual, in a kind of reciprocal relationship?
You could probably, if you want historical examples that aren't controversial, you could probably look towards ancient Sparta,
Mm-hmm.
or perhaps some city states in European history that would essentially eugenically mold the individual, rear the individual, and then expect them to reciprocate to the next generation as well. And in my opinion, that's the only way to create a sustainable community, is to have a state or some authority helping set parameters around the individual. And I think there have to be parameters no matter what dogma or point of view or philosophy you adhere to. It's not limitless. If you do think it's
Mm-hmm.
limitless, you're probably going to go insane at some point. But
Mm-hmm.
if the state can, in a positive way, set parameters that benefit the individual, and the individual can populate that state in a positive way to help
Mm-hmm.
the next generation, I think that's the only way. Like in ancient Sparta or those city states I was referring to.
Mm-hmm. Well, Nullis is a historian, so he should probably have a lot to say on this. What are your thoughts, Nullis?
Well, I mean, the first thing that would come to my mind is the pre-liberal democracies. That would be an important point of departure on that, and seeing the relationship of the citizen vis-a-vis the state and how they related to each other. The individual had responsibilities. Not every individual in the state was a citizen. There were very.
Key.
That is key, right? I'm sorry, Jim. Please go.
No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. I just wanted to emphasize that point.
So you have, and you have even in medieval Europe, you had the city-states, the various cities in the Holy Roman Empire. They enjoyed a different kind of freedom within the city, the boundaries of the city. You had the various formations of trade communities. You had various merchant communities that were some semi-independent. So there were definitely different examples throughout history before liberalism that can help us understand this. I think that formulating a system at this stage right now, I think would require a broader conversation.
Mm-hmm.
But I think putting this back into the Imperium Art question. For me, this is about the question of the individual's responsibilities toward the state and the state's responsibilities toward the individual, and how we can then formulate this in our art. Meaning, if you write a story about a main character, then that main character doesn't have the message, well, I'll do whatever I want and I'll follow my heart, which is kind of a nihilist approach to everything. But at the same time, there is a tradition of exploration where in the 19th century you had many young aristocrats who traveled Europe and sought to enlighten themselves, and again, right, the Enlightenment. But there is this balance here also, because we do want to have cultured individuals, we do want to have quality individuals, and we do want to have people that can contribute into the collective. So you don't really want to have drones in your society. At the same time, you definitely don't want to have a society that's going in as many directions as there are citizens.
Yeah, that would be social schizophrenia.
Exactly.
So this kind of leads interestingly to Jim's next point that I singled out in his essay. Consider, I'm quoting him, consider how we can eugenically create more powerful mimetic weapons to threaten the cultural status quo and shift the Overton window in our favor, similar to the hippies. You had made a point about hippies earlier. And hippies, I think they they symbolize that individualism, nihilism, hedonism, all these things that we've been talking about. And he continues, as we noted, the enemy has become lethargically homogeneous in their aesthetic, and most white people have nothing but contempt for all so-called modern art, whether in a museum or on the radio. Dynamism, vitality, and innovation are what we can bring to this cultural conflict. This is powerful stuff, Jim. I definitely, all of this just speaks to me. I think that you're writing a lot of the thoughts that we already have. Did you want to expand on that a little bit?
Uh, the only thing I could think of would be mimetic weapons. I feel like that at some point it has to devolve into a conversation about mimetics. But I think that that's probably the thing that we can create through this Imperium art that would be lasting a generation or two from now at the least if we could do it properly. And I mean, there's still concepts and ideas, symbols from thousands of generations ago that we still adhere to, and that's residual of their culture, of their lives.
I guess speaking just for myself, what I'm attempting to do in my own Imperium art is to, in some sense, create new mimetics, new symbols, combining old ones in a way that is unique to our time and our politics. If you see certain symbols that represent political ideologies in European history, churches, various other kinds of symbols that we're all aware of that's in this enormous buffet of history, and then kind of recontextualizing them in a sort of a new, slightly surreal art form, I think is my attempt anyway, and I'm struggling with this with great agony to create this new form of art, that people can connect with that and say, oh, I know that represents Rome. I know that represents the Scythians or the Slavs or the Catholic faith or et cetera, et cetera. But then they have to kind of rebuild meaning within their own mind. Well, why are these things together in this way? And so this is where I'm at in my own art. Do you feel that is creating new mimetics? Would you say that, or would you be able to give me advice on that?
I don't know about advice. I would not. I wouldn't even try to give any advice on art, but I do think that in terms of mimetics, uh, blatantly posting them in images, I don't know if that's the necessarily optimal approach, and not even hiding them, but as personifying them as certain things, because a person can relate to a tree or another person or some object in a painting
Yeah.
as much more than a symbol. But if that person is at a deep fundamental level, is that symbol, then once they realize that there is the catharsis that nihilist keeps referring to, there's that catharsis that brings them into this collective consciousness. Once they realize that, and that meme has been implanted in them through the art,
Mhm. That I think you in a sense just said the goal of Imperium Art is to create once again catharsis that brings people into this racial awakening. And I don't really like the term racial awakening. It sounds it's just sort of clunky and it could be a little controversial for some people. You know, like the racial awakening, don't let that happen to me. But
Right?
it in effect is actually what it is recognizing, wow, we are envied and hated around the world, and at the same time look at the great things that we've accomplished in the world in history. What does it all mean, and where do I intersect with all of these things? Nullis, did you want to share some of your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that both of you captured it perfectly. What I would say, what I found interesting in this conversation was the question of symbolism in terms of its relationship to the way people identify with that symbol. So if we create new symbols with which people can't, to which people can't relate, then we basically it defeats the purpose. On
Hmm.
the other hand, if we incorporate familiar symbols and through the familiar symbols create new symbology organically, I think that is probably a better path forward. But I was just thinking about, and maybe it's not as related to symbolism, but it is in a way, is the story of Spartacus. And so in contemporary society, Spartacus is a hero. And in reality, Spartacus is not a hero.
Hmm.
He
Hmm.
and so why isn't he a hero? Because the reason he became a liberal hero is because he represents freedom. He represents a fight against authority. He is that ragtag rebel force that's fighting against the empire.
Yeah, right.
Um,
And
so
and he
he
was a slave, right?
and he was a slave. So there's a lot of symbology in Spartacus with just saying the name, and this is why I'm bringing up Spartacus, because just by saying the name Spartacus, a whole bunch of concepts immediately pop up, and people already immediately associate a lot of symbology with the name Spartacus. You don't even have to say more than Spartacus. I am Spartacus, right?
Hmm.
And so then the question is, how do we define Spartacus? And how are we contextualizing this? Now, if you want to look at it from a nationalist perspective in terms of fighting for national identity or fighting for independence, then Spartacus could be, in theory, an interesting meme. But then, if you look at the overall context, Spartacus was also an anarchist,
Mm.
and so he was set
Wow.
to destroy the order of the empire. So
Mm.
then, how do we relate to it? Now, I don't want to say one way or the other. This is something we have to figure out, because I'm personally more inclined to say that when I was younger, I liked Spartacus. When I'm older, I don't like Spartacus.
Yeah, yeah.
And so now the question is, okay, but it's a generational thing as well. So
Mm.
my mentality is somewhat different now than it was when I was younger. When I'm younger, I'm more rebellious.
Mhm.
And so we have to understand these details. And again, I'm just using this as an example. Um, and we could say, why isn't Crassus the hero? You know, I mean,
Yeah.
and so this, or Pompey, and Pompey was a great general, and why isn't he elevated to the status of hero?
Mhm.
He's he saved the empire, although some say he stole it from Crassus, but that's a detail. But the but the point I'm making is that we have to figure out these things, and I'm not really talking specifically about history per se, but what I'm saying is that here is an example where you have one word, one name, and a whole bunch of ideas are embedded into this concept. And our society today are full of these. So when you said, for example, racial awakening, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
That immediately brought, and I'm sure that not among our circles, but I'm sure that it would bring out in the broader context, it would bring out this kind of a pejorative almost like this distaste in their mouth. Ooh, I don't like that term. I
I'm
don't,
not racist. I'm not
I'm
racist.
not, why? Right, because they've been indoctrinated to believe that the idea of having an identity beyond a certain acceptable point
Hmm.
is taboo.
Hmm.
So, as artists, our goal should be to break these taboos.
Hmm.
So I'm trying to. I don't want to ramble on and on
No,
because
I'm loving where you're going. Actually, you gave me an inspiration. I think I might have an insight to this. If try to look at it from, I guess, a commercial standpoint, where movies about rebels are going to sell really well with teenagers,
right.
and those are the ones that are going to pay, however much money on the weekend to go see the movie, and so that's like a kind of a, I don't want to say capitalist, but like that's kind of an angle on this where, now not everything is about movies, right? You have literature, music, but even in, but yeah, we're kind of infected with that, like snotty-nosed, angry, rebellious teenager who thinks he knows everything. That's kind of the
I,
culture that we've been indoctrinated with through the arts.
Donald, sorry to interrupt, but I just thought of something. This is an economic question as much as
Mhm.
it is an artistic
Yeah.
question, because the demographic that spends the most money are teenage boys.
Right.
Precise. Yeah.
And so what we're talking about is appealing to them and asking ourselves. Now, I'm not saying that we have to formulate Imperium art to appeal to that particular demographic. What I am saying, though, is that the current culture that we're in has realized on an economic level which and they conduct detailed studies on this to figure out which demographic, what theme, what topics appeal to which demographic, and they try to target it appropriately. What you notice is that the adult white male population tends to be either, well, maybe today it's a little different, but a lot of our 30, 40, well, maybe 20, 30-year olds, they haven't grown up. They still live in fantasy
Right.
land.
Right.
Yeah.
The stunting of our manhood
And
through
that's an
arts.
economic, but that's an economic consideration more than it is a cultural consideration, because what they're trying to achieve by that, the producers, the people who are investing money in all of these, and it's not just in film, it's in music,
Yeah.
it's in literature, it's in everything that you see. Um, what they're trying to do is they're trying to expand that demographic to a wider audience. So they will basically indoctrinate boys, or, well, let's just say a certain demographic, and then they will try to keep that demographic until as long as possible, so that they now expanded the market to a larger. They have a larger market
Mhm.
share.
Sure, sure.
Yeah, that's exactly it. It's a feedback loop. And
Right.
I think you really see that with the way that, these neckbeard guys fawn over Marvel movies. They've been feedback looped their entire lives through this process.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And it becomes a drug, like we talked about in previous episodes, where you have endless cycles of stories, and once you binge watch one series, you feel empty.
Yeah.
Watching a binge watch, but binge watching a series is like a one night stand.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Wow, that's
That's
well
true.
done.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
and it is, because you leave that sort of with this feeling of emptiness, because there's nothing beyond the purpose of that particular moment.
But she
And
said she loved me. No, okay.
and but it's true. And if you think about it, really a lot of this ties together. Now, how, I'm not an expert, I'm not a sociologist, I'm not an
Right,
expert in this field,
right.
but what I feel instinctively is that what this is what's going on. And I think that Jim in his essay beautifully captures this condition,
Mm.
where that feedback loop is constantly promoted. And so now the question rises up, and now I want to circle back to the symbolism issue, right? So through this whole process, people are indoctrinated to associate certain things, certain symbols, with certain narratives. And so now you say one word to somebody, and they already associate a number of different things with that one word. And so now we live in a society, and how we have to break that is going to be a huge challenge for us if we want to succeed with the Imperium Art initiative.
I have a point I want to bring up here, and this is maybe a challenge for you guys to help me with. So I'm doing visual arts, and the concept of heroism. How do I put this? I'm trying to create a kind of a white diaspora man, one kind of character that mythologically symbolizes us all from the European diaspora. And every time I approach this, I feel like, does this look too much like video game art? Does this look too much like comic book art? And I realized, like, though that's been taken. It's like those fields, video games, comics, and movies have kind of taken that. I don't know what the word is I'm looking for. The hero trope, I guess. And I don't like that. I mean, I'm not knocking video games and comics. I don't mean that, but I don't like the fact that I can't draw a character without people saying, "Oh, is that the guy from Xbox something or other series?" No, I don't even know what that game is. I didn't even. So people see through those lenses already, and that poses a huge challenge for me. I think on the one hand, I feel like, okay, you might have to just work with it. Maybe you can throw them a judo flip, and figure out how can I twist that trope or something, or not, or abandon it completely. I don't know. What are your thoughts, Jim?
Yeah, I mean that's a real challenge. It's probably frustrating too to be
Fair.
like, no, this is my own original thing.
Right.
And I can imagine that just grating you all day. But
It does.
there's perhaps you could. I don't know about like a superhero team, but perhaps you could create a community as hero. Like try to create something.
Or authoritarian hero. I'm liking this.
I'm sure you'd get a lot of parallels with that one.
Okay, I'm rubbing my hands like a certain kind of person. Anyway, Nihilist, what do you think?
The Empire did nothing wrong.
I love it. Yeah, your lack of faith disturbs me. Yeah. Well, okay. So let me move on a little bit here. I'll read another quote from Jim's excellent essay here. If Enlightenment values are ones of progress, equality, individualism, rebellion, and material scientific truth, then pre-Enlightenment values are you're going to have to tell me, and the opposite of those. So tradition, variance, hierarchy, community, loyalty, and the archetypal spiritual truth. Escaping from the Enlightenment requires the abandonment of its frame, which Imperium Art offers. So I stumbled through that a little bit, but I think this is key. We're talking about the values of tradition. What do you mean by variance, Jim? What's your point there?
I mean that mainly my point is that things can be different.
Mm-hmm.
Modernity, Enlightenment values, post World War II hippie values that I use different terms to, but I'm essentially trying to describe the same thing of something that tries to make everything into its default state, because that way you can sell the same product to everyone. Sort of like what we were talking about with Spartacus or any of these hero, the feedback loop is that if you can sell a product to the vast majority who don't want to improve themselves, who are in this default state, if you can make everyone in that state, you can not only do you not have to put effort into the products you sell them, but you can sell it to everyone at the same time.
And it's mostly escapism. You don't watch movies to become a better person or to figure out things, and what's the meaning of life. Of course, those are the best movies, in my opinion, the ones that do give you that transformation. But I'm hearing what you're saying here. Community, loyalty. Now, here you use the term and archetypal spiritual truth. That's a bit vague. Could you maybe explain that one?
So I think probably the best way to unwrap that or define that better would be that if the Enlightenment valued material scientific truth, that would be akin to rationality or logic, like what we were saying before. Then the archetypical spiritual truth would be more of an emotional, instinctual truth. And that's where we've neglected, and we've instead gone to the scientific truth side of things, emphasized that anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Very interesting. I think poets and musicians are, really in tune with that. Artists in general, that's in a sense what we are. We're sort of the shamans of these kind of archetypes. We channel instinctive spiritual truths, hopefully. So that opens a massive can of worms, because the word spiritual covers a great deal of ground, but it's something that Nullis and I talk about
Yeah.
a lot, and it's certainly central.
Well, if I could just quickly add to that,
Sure.
To me, the I would go so far as to say humanism was really the point of departure as opposed to the Enlightenment.
Mhm.
And the humanism, although humanism has many different shades, and there are, and again, I don't want to neglect all the great achievements from humanism all the way through to the 20th century. Again, there's a number of excellent works of art. So it's not, you can't just throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak.
Mhm.
With that said, the main complaint and the main logical flaw that I see is that in the Enlightenment, humanism as well, takes morality out of the hands of the divine, out of an absolute truth, and places it in the hands of man. And they assume that man is perfect and man is flawless. Yet in their messages, and yet in everything that they describe in art and in various cultural expressions, man is always displayed as flawed. So now you have this flawed individual that has the power of morality in his hands, and so now you can understand why we are where we are today, because essentially this morality has been formed to shape the interests of man, as opposed to becoming an absolute that stands above us, something that we strive toward.
Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely. And the devil's advocate argument is that, it's society that corrupts the individual. It's society that makes them lesser. And that's why they have to create those arguments to address the flawed nature of our own being.
Right. So they say they on the one hand they say that man is flawless, hence that's why man is has morality in his hands. Or let me rephrase that. Uh, Morality was taken away from the divine and given to man through the Enlightenment, because the assumption was that man is by nature flawless, a flawless, perfect being.
Mm.
Yet Yet in every variation of its expression, it's always showing man as a flawed individual. So this is almost like this contradiction in logic.
Mm-mm. I'm really sad that Tyler Hamilton couldn't join us today, because I feel he would have so much to contribute to this conversation.
Yes. Yes.
It's sad. We miss him. Um, these are powerful points, and I'm really glad our listeners can join in. And we strongly encourage you to leave comments, engage us in this conversation, bring your thoughts to it, especially artists in the White Art Collective. This is clearly about us and for us as well. So let me move on a little bit with one more point, and then we'll go into Jim's 7 points, 7 suggestions, if you will, on Imperium Art. So quoting Jim again here, concepts like Imperium Art hope to help our people leave the dystopia of modernity behind for good by, sorry, my reading is awful, leaving it behind for good by reinstating a love of ourselves and a love for divine beauty. All art is religious. All impose values onto and interpret reality, and we must not let our people be polluted against ourselves any longer. So there's some big concepts in there. The central thing for me is the reconnection or the connection of Imperium art to divine beauty. We obviously have a lot of political things to say, and we're interacting in our arts, with politics, right? But underneath it all, there's this kind of like harmonic that ties it all together, and that's this connection with the divine. And this is, I think, really the difference between true art and, say, commercial art or something like that.
Yeah.
We are already deeply grounded in that, and it somehow comes through, even in the pain and the angst that we express towards, white replacement, white genocide, all these problems that we're facing. But I just wanted to let Jim talk a little bit. Could you open that up a bit more for us, your point there?
Sure, yeah. So in a passage or in a sentence fragment a little bit before that, I note that I have high art in quotation marks, and I say true high art is a mirroring of the truth through a reflection of the divine beauty. So I don't necessarily think that you have to believe in God, although I think that that helps you get there a little bit quicker to believe in divine beauty, like a platonic form of whatever it is that we're referring to. But art is supposed to reflect or refract that image into something that's palatable, into something that we can connect with. And the closer it gets to that divine beauty, the more concrete or the more accurate its reflection is, then the more punch it's going to have emotionally on the person who's participating in that art.
Mm-hmm. Beautifully said. Beautifully said. Nellis, any points?
No, I fully agree with that. I think that that's a very accurate definition.
Nice. All right, so let's get right into Jim's 7 points in his essay here. So I'm going to read his points, and then I would like to share my own thoughts, and then of course we can kind of go do a little round table. So once again, quoting Jim here, I propose 7 key points that I believe Imperium art would have to formulate and apply to further the pro-white movement's main priority of creating sustainable white communities by liberating our people from the diseases of modernity. Number 1, create images, symbols, terms, and language that facilitate anti-liberal thought and action. Oh, that's some powerful stuff. So right off the bat, I have to first, tip my hat and salute Jason Kuna, No White Guilt on YouTube, for doing that already. And these are terms that he's brought into our vernacular: Western kind, Western biospirit, meme pathogens. And so other words concepts or words that we need to start formulating, in my opinion, would be somehow reframing these things, like we were discussing before, going from an adolescent frame to an adult frame in the arts, for example, that the universe is binary, that there are only 2 genders. I'm in a 30-day Facebook ban right now because I said there are only 2 genders. and you have day and
How
night.
dare you?
I know, challenge the liberal status quo. So day and night, male, female, life and death, young and old. The universe is binary. It's a cosmic kind of principle. So another thing that we need to create language for, in my opinion, is the primacy of family. New ways of talking about nationalism, about power, about sovereignty, white self-determination, to create a parasite-free society. That's one of the most key things right there, is because the parasites that have been living off of us for hundreds of years have gotten us to the problems that we're into today. We should learn new ways to talk about high trust versus low trust societies. How do we interact with other whites as opposed to non-whites? And to what degree, on what scale are we in a high trust or a low trust society? That right there is very much, if you want to learn more about that, go to American Renaissance and start learning about the science of behavior and DNA and race. So DNA versus culture and the scale of identity. So, the thought of we, let's say, Caucasians share a common root DNA, but culturally we're different in different ways, right? Slavs versus Celts, or all these various things. We have these things, but also, if let's say, if I were adopted as a baby to a family in China and raised in China, I didn't speak any English, I knew no American culture, I would be totally alien. America would be completely alien to me. I would be culturally Chinese, you see, although my DNA is Caucasian. So that I think is a very confusing gray area for a lot of people, and something that maybe we don't talk about enough. The big elephant in the room, in my opinion, is things like biracial people, or people who you could say that African Americans, for example, that are born and raised in America are Westerners, right? They're not Africans, right? So in the sense that culturally they're not Africans, their DNA is. So do they fit into the Western biosphere? This is challenging ideas, but fascinating and important. So I really took a lot of spotlight on that one. Did you guys want to contribute to that? Jim, could you jump in on that a bit?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I think that's pretty accurate, and I think that if you could define, uh, if you could weaponize what you were saying about, uh, culturally this, but genetically that,
Mm,
you could really help a lot of people understand why we're in the situation we are in right now and how they've been affected by it. Because you look at what's going on in the U.S. and major metropolitan areas right now, and
mhm,
most of that is because of certain cultural cues that have been activated that are necessarily anti our genetics, whereas if or pro someone else's. And if
mm,
you could somehow articulate that aspect, I'm not exactly sure how, but you could
mm,
help a lot of people come to these ideas a lot quicker.
mm,
Yeah, I would also, this sort of kind of echoes what E. Michael Jones also talks about
mm,
with logos and with the culture, where he uses the example that if an African is born in Poland and raised in Poland, then according to E. Michael Jones, he's Polish. Now, I would say that that's not entirely
no,
correct.
no, no, definitely not.
And I would also say that that is absolutely not correct. Now, what happens in many cases is that even though someone might be born, let's say someone from Europe is born and raised and adopted by a Chinese family and raised in China, they will still be the other in
Mhm.
terms of their social content. So they will always know that they are the other.
Of
They are
course,
not Chinese.
of course.
They might. So the question then comes: are they really culturally Chinese? And I would argue that they're not. They are they are raised in the Chinese culture in this particular example, but I think that if they met someone else from Europe, let's say that this person had German heritage, just for argument's sake, and this person traveled to Germany and met a bunch of people that look like him, then he will instinctively find that he fits in with that group a lot more than he does with the culture in which he grew up. And so I think that so culture is definitely a very important aspect of it. But I can give you also countless examples throughout European history where you had cultural enclaves. I'll just use the Hungarian example. You had, for example, numerous German migrants that after the Mongolian invasion and after the Turkic invasion, Hungary was basically decimated and depopulated, so they had to repopulate the kingdom, and so they brought in a lot of migrants from Germany.
Wow.
And so what happened was many of these migrants over the centuries assimilated, and one can't say that all of them retained their cultural identity, but there was still a strong group of Germans who, in spite of being there for centuries, retained their unique cultural identity. So and there was the distinguishing point on who's who, what culture you come from, what you look like, what your ethnicity is. It does make a difference. And so we have to be, we have to be cognizant of this. And I think that that's also a key component in understanding in the greater context of when we're talking about the European diaspora, or we're talking about the white diaspora, that regardless of where you grew up. I mean, let me give you another example. Someone who's a German who was raised in Brazil, for example. They don't even speak German anymore because they've been in Brazil for maybe 4 or 5 generations.
I have a friend like that, actually. But yeah.
Right. And I think there's even a few towns like that in Brazil where the whole community, or the majority of the community, is German, of German descent. So, but they still identify as Germans,
Yes,
even though they don't speak it.
true.
And so we have to be, we have to be cognizant of this. We have to understand that they distinguish themselves not only racially, but also ethnically, and even if not culturally, but in some esoteric way, kind of, so to speak.
So this sidebar, this huge sidebar, really demonstrates the need to talk about these subjects: identity, DNA versus culture. That I still feel that there's a lot that has not been covered in the dissident right. We're facing things that are right in front of our nose a lot of the times, and it's good to have these discussions. But to pull it back to Jim's essay, about creating images, symbols, terms, and language that facilitate anti-liberal thought. That's a fabulous point. And so, yeah, that's something we'll put out there, and I think listeners can chime in on that too. So number 2, oh, and I'm sorry, did I cut you off, Jim? Did you want to comment more on that at all, or?
No. I agree with both of you guys, actually.
Okay.
I think it's.
All
I
right,
think
sorry.
it's
I just losing track here. All right, number 2, emphasis on traditional heroism apart from the hippie frame of scrappy rebel underdog or nihilist do-gooder, by showcasing many different yet archetypal forms of heroism. Counterpoint the archetype. Okay, I'm sorry. This is my reaction to that. So counterpoint the archetype of the hipster, soy boy, liberal, bourgeois, cosmopolitan academic. What would be the counterpoint of that if this were a video game? Sorry, I had to bring that up.
if this was a video game, it'd probably be Conan the Barbarian or something like that.
There you go. Barbarian versus soy boy challenge match. Okay. And then, lots of thoughts come to mind. I mean, I do, in my art now, I'm grappling with the idea of creating a symbolic characters that represent, the Slavs, the Celts, the Swedes, the Romans, etc. And I don't know if it's the right to do or not. I don't know if, I'm kind of struggling with it, right? Because I'm building the ship as I launch it. But anyway, your key point here is emphasis on traditional heroism. So, Jim, would you expand a little bit on that? Could you explain for us?
Well, I think that a traditional form of heroism, it's really weird to me because in a lot of ways the superhero movie phenomenon tries to encapsulate this as much as possible. They've tried to create this grandiose visions, that sense of destiny in these superheroes, but ultimately the superheroes are beholden to these very cucky values. So I don't think that they could be actual heroes from our point of view, from the what you would call the pre-enlightenment point of view, or I guess you'd say.
Mm-hmm.
But
it doesn't hurt when the actors support liberal causes as well and cuck out on Twitter or whatever. But yeah.
Yeah, it's all part of. It's like an act that never ends. I mean,
Well,
but sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
All I was going to say after that would be I think you'd have to look towards more historical examples,
Mm,
probably pre-industrial examples
wow.
of heroism to get a really deep picture of what that would look like.
Hmm. It should probably tie back into those other topics like, family, nation, maybe sacrifice, maybe, I don't know. Nellis, did you have some thoughts?
Well, yeah, I mean, actually, in many ways, Joseph Campbell does capture the hero's journey very well. And so I think that he writes about it extensively, and I think that we can use those elements in our writing. The problem isn't the theory of the hero's journey, in my opinion. The problem is the positioning of the hero. So what I mean by that is if you look, because every hero's journey has to be compelling. So if you look at it in a formulaic context, the hero gets the call, the hero doesn't want to continue, is a reluctant
Mm-hmm.
hero, does not want to start the journey, and then goes through this whole process of realization and so on and so forth. And so these formulaic tropes exist in current pop culture. I don't think that that's not necessarily the case. I think the problem is that what they do is they inject the values, and they inject certain messages in the hero's journey that are an anathema to the hero's journey, if that makes any sense. So, for example, if I could take the Thor movies as a good example, when Kenneth Branagh when he directed the first Thor movie, it was about an insolent young man, son, who was punished by his father, and he had to prove himself.
Mm-hmm.
And he went through this process of proving himself to his father and to himself that he is in fact worthy of his station, worthy of that hammer, right? And so in a sense, the first Thor movie was not that bad if you think about it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but the reception of that movie was not that. It wasn't. How should I say? I think it made money, but it wasn't promoted much either. I think that and then the subsequent movies were just disastrous. But I think
I,
I but
I
I think that the point of if you look at the entire arc of the Thor character in the Marvel universe,
mm,
his whole arc should have been that he was a young, arrogant son, a prince, who was punished, who had to go through a lot of trials and tribulations to prove his value, to prove his worthiness, and that he ultimately learns that this is how he learns ultimately to become the good king.
mm,
And that was all taken away from him in this last movie. It was like just
mm.
totally they just neutered him in this last movie. And
And
so
that's a white archetype too. That I mean, that is very intentionally done to destroy the white
correct.
king. I mean, I have a major axe to grind about that, but
I do too. Yeah.
oh,
And
man.
I think that when you look at it, what they're doing is they're using the mechanics of the hero's journey, and they're applying it to immoral characters.
I think that's a great take on that. I had never considered that, but yeah, that's a great take that they pretty much undermine their own unique message.
Hmm.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I can't pronounce his name. The new hot film director. He did this recent movie about Nazi youth at a summer camp or other, and he did Thor 3, Ragnarok, and I made a video critiquing that whole film
Hmm.
and shredded it. I mean, beyond shredding. I mean, breaking pieces into smaller pieces. It's a feminist fantasy where the most powerful man is a gay Jew, and
Hmm.
it is the most insulting spit in the face of all whites and of all time. I'm just still reeling in anger over how terrible that film is. I'll probably post a link to my movie review below this one so people can watch it.
You
But
know,
yeah,
just quickly, if you think about it, it's a bait and switch
oh,
scheme.
totally, hugely, yeah,
And
huge,
because the bait of it is that they introduce a character through a traditional hero's journey. They did this with Luke Skywalker. They introduced, although we
Yeah.
could argue, of course, that Luke Skywalker was a liberal character, and then again we can argue that for from another perspective. But in terms of the hero journey itself, the hero's journey, Luke Skywalker had to go through a whole bunch of tests to prove his worthiness of becoming a Jedi. It didn't happen overnight. And so that's the bait. That they have to use those traditional tropes. They have to use those traditional methodologies to bring you into the story. But once you're in and once you're invested into the story, that's when the manipulation occurs, I think. And I think that's when they try to then change it around. Because if they came out with a movie that was straight out, and I think they did that in several attempts, where they had a remake of Ghostbusters, or they did a remake of what's
right.
Ocean's 11, right?
Yeah.
And when they did these remakes, those were very explicitly just feminist, but and again, it's not against women, but it was just the way that this was used, the way it was just obvious that it was a clear ideological manipulation, and there was no bait and switch, right? There was no bait. It was just a switch. And so that's why they failed, and that's why they failed. So what's important for us, I think, and I'm sorry to go off on a tangent with this, but what's important for us, I believe, in Imperium Art is not to discount the value of the bait, because those are still valid and traditional methodologies that we can utilize. The problem isn't there. The problem is once we capture the audience, once you bring in the audience, you have a responsibility to not manipulate them into indoctrination of some ideology that it goes against who you are.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Or demoralizes them,
right, exactly.
intentionally. Yeah.
Correct.
Well, did you want to contribute to this point, the second point, Jim, about emphasizing heroism before I move on?
No, I think you guys dug into it far deeper than I could even imagine. I mean, those
That's what we do around here,
those are some hot takes, guys. I mean, that's
Hot
some good
takes.
stuff.
That's how we roll here.
Yeah. Welcome to the Imperium crew, y'all. Sorry, that was slightly cringy. Okay, so number 3. Okay, so again, quoting Jim, display attractive, healthy, and well-adjusted men and women. A, in their biologically preferred roles, but without a sense of repression. B, in loyal, organic relationships. C, with families, but without devolving into exclusive nuclear family suburban worship. For example, presenting extended families as a traditionally alternative option. That's actually a lot to unpack there. But Jim, would you like to jump in and explain?
Well, basically, I'm just saying that we don't want the people who are advertising this thing to be ugly. I mean,
Yeah.
we want our characters and the
More
people
about
who
yeah.
right, exactly. The characters and the relationships that they're in to be in moral positions that attract people. We don't want them to be unattractive, like that's what the left does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that the topic of, how do I say, of families is interesting because we're living in really, really broken times. And, obviously the movement is very, very pro, nuclear family and the whole thing, traditionalism, etc. But in reality, a lot of us are divorced or grew up in divorced families and et cetera, et cetera. So I guess that's kind of tricky ground. I don't know. What do you think about that, Jim?
So I think you could. There's definitely a possibility to exclude some people who would not relate to that. I can see that. I
Hmm.
thankfully had the opportunity to grow up in a pretty traditional family, living near my grandparents. So I might be more fortunate than a lot of other people. But that
Hmm.
said, I don't know if you would want to take, again, to use a Marvel movie, the Guardians of the Galaxy approach, where
Hmm.
your actual biological family doesn't matter. It's all about your friends. They can replace your family. In
Yeah.
fact, your family might even be trying to kill you. So you should
Oh
stick with
God.
your friends.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a good alternative
Well,
either.
well, it's a great analogy you just made there, a great point that you made, because that's absolutely central to cultural Marxism, is to destroy the family.
Hmm.
So I think that really has to take center stage. Somehow that has to come across, but I think that's difficult to do in terms of like making art that's interesting and engaging, that doesn't seem like some kind of pastoral Hallmark greeting card kind of morality. I suppose it may have to be done in a more subtle way. Does that make sense?
Um, yeah, I just wanted to add that I think you can create anti-heroes. You can create
Mm,
heroes that are flawed. I think that it's the question, or let me rephrase that: the main character as opposed to a hero. So you can have. I mean, I was just thinking of the Sin City character of Marv, played by Mickey Rourke.
mm-hmm,
He was a flawed character. He was an ugly character,
mm-hmm,
yet he was a hero because he fought against, he basically was trying to fight for something good, and he tried to rise above his station. So I think, or rise above his, let me rephrase that, rise above his predicament, right?
mm-hmm.
So I think that we can incorporate characters of different types, but I think what Jim is trying to say here is not, we're not talking about creating a Hallmark movie. What we're saying is that the idealization that we're striving toward are these character types, are these archetypes, so that when you have a character who's flawed, for example, I'm just going to throw something off the top of my head. Let's say you have a detective. He's jaded. He's seen terrible things, and he's just this really gritty anti-hero.
Mm.
But then he meets a woman, and this woman changes him in a way that he never would have imagined, and it brings in the issue of the loyal organic relationship. It presents the biologically preferred roles, because the woman is not a feminist. She's a very feminine,
Mhm.
caring, nurturing character who's helping this gritty character rise above his own nihilism to become a family with her. So that's
Mm.
just a good example of something where you can take an anti-hero using Jim's points here and really presenting it in a way where we can identify it in the current era.
Well, there you go, Jim. You've got your next book. Okay.
I'm taking notes. I'm taking notes.
Yeah, yeah, I was gonna say that. All right, so number four, quoting Jim again, inspire a spiritually moral framework that puts emphasis on A, personal perfection through action informed by deep contemplation. I would just put an aside here, the warrior poet. B, loyalty towards your people. C, nature and its organic beauty. So these I think are pretty agreeable and not hard to understand.
Mhm.
Jim, did you want to maybe expand a little bit, or should we move on?
Unless anyone else has anything to say, I'm good with that.
Okay, well, you wrote it, so okay. So number five then, advocate for more realistic local white community action rather than grand national level programs. Very interesting concept. I mean, there's two ways to look at that. One, I'm saying, okay, in the arts versus, say, activism, Um, I, for one, am profoundly frustrated with our lack of actual physical power as a movement. And I think that's what we do in the arts is we create the culture, the ideas, and we sort of work from that paradigm, if you will. Um, but I don't know, how could the arts maybe play a role in some form of white community action? What did you mean by that, Jim?
Well, I think in a direct sense, you could probably have, if let's say I live in an apartment complex, I could try to interact. The art could inspire me to interact more with my neighbors and maybe have some sort of get together, create some sort of community. We meet up, we have a book club, we do da da da,
Hmm.
and rather than getting frustrated over the lack of national level implementation of the policies that we desire. It's not happening right now. It's not the way that I want it. Whereas
Hmm.
that sort of stuff really shouldn't affect your day to day life. The only thing that should affect that is you and the environment that you're creating around you.
Hmm.
I think our opponents have done this phenomenally. You see
Yeah.
Hispanics or Indians or whoever creating local communities where they get together. They don't even speak English when they're at these things,
Right.
and they organize whatever they want.
Hmm. I have to just drop White Art Collective Friday, Saturday, Sunday nights around 8 o'clock. There's shows all the time, or rather every weekend. So if people actually want to be a part of white community action in this sense, go to dlive.com/ White Art Collective. Check it out on weekends. Whiteartcollective.com. It's on Gab, Twitter, etc. So links below. Any thoughts, Nellis?
Yeah, I think this is actually a very important point. I think that it's important to have. I mean, for example, the White Art Collective is a prime example of an online community that focuses on these points, but it is limited in the real world because everyone is so far apart from each other. So there's a very there's a logistical obstacle of creating real life get-togethers. Although hopefully we will be able to do that in the near future. But aside from that, I think Jim is right that we should focus on community theater, community book clubs, community cultural events, and then branch out, network with each other, network with similar groups where you can have, for example, let's say someone writes a book. Let's just take Jim's play, for example. Jim can then read his play in various cities throughout the nation at these various community get-togethers. So I think that would already be a huge bonus, especially for artists who really are kind of in limbo in how to promote their art.
Mm-mm. I would love to see more plays from the White Art Collective or from, people in Imperium Art. That's a very traditional thing that's been going on for a very, very long time
Yeah.
in the Western civilization. We don't, like they say, we don't have the budgets for big films, and I just feel like that could be a cool thing. That could
Yeah.
be another aspect. So, all right, let's move on here. Looking at these, uh, I've lost my place here. Inspire. Okay, we did that. Number
6.
6. Thanks. See, I was never very good at math. That's why I can't figure these numbers out. Preserve distinct ethnic heritage. For example, have a standard but don't homogenize. So
Hmm.
this isn't fascinating because Nollis and I have talked about this numerous times. So the issue of representation and bias, meaning like, okay, I've noticed in my own work, I tend more towards kind of the Anglosphere or Celtic kind of symbols and culture. I'm drawn to Germanic symbols and culture. Um, so but that's natural to me and my ethnic heritage. So you know, I can't really represent Slavs or Hungarians or, Italians or etc. So, but yet I somehow want to be able to bring them into my art as well. I want to be able to say we're family. And that's a tough thing for me as an artist to figure out how do I do that. So, creators, my thoughts are that creators will naturally gravitate towards their own ethnosphere. So ethnosphere could be a new term for us. We should be as multicultural, meaning within the European diaspora, about other white nations as possible to gain a greater literacy of each other's ways and experiences. So, okay, I was on Nullis's show where he had a Croatian and a Polish gentleman on, and wow, that was so cool for me. It was a cultural experience because there's such a wall between Western and Central Europe. We don't get a chance, I think, so much to communicate with our brothers over there, behind the Iron Curtain, as it were. I've interviewed
Hmm.
French creators, and I'm part French as well, so that I kind of get off on, yeah, I'm connecting and I'm learning something from them. That's exciting. So I feel as if like that should be a project in, or even a rule in Imperium Art, to seek out and learn more from other people in the white diaspora. And so these are just my own responses to number 6, to preserve distinct ethnic heritage. What do you think, Jim?
So that was actually that point was actually the impetus for this whole essay, because I had heard that brought up at least 2 or 3 times in the other interviews or other roundtables that you guys had done prior to this one. And that
Mm-hmm.
was something that I think Hyrieth, I know that even she has
Hyrith
some
will
questions.
do. She says Hyrith, so we can say.
I know even she has some questions about the pronunciation, but regardless, I that was the point that really made me want to sort of dig into the whole idea of Imperium Art, and I think that allowance for distinction is part of the anti-enlightenment, or no less anti-humanism perspective that I would like to see it facilitate, where you're allowing other minute differences between interpretations rather than one sort of formalized, overarching, every town has to have a McDonald's in it sort of approach.
Uh, yeah. So not to repeat too much about that particular topic, since Nullis and I have talked about it a lot, but I do kind of, how do I say, my approach is more like, I suppose, homogenous, whereas his is more retain your ethnic individuality. And so I think that's good that we're on both sides of that discussion. And I think this is just going to have to work itself out organically through the
Hmm.
through the artists. I mean, we don't dictate to our people what they can and can't do. But we should all join in this conversation about, well, what are we trying to do, and what would serve us better, what would serve our people better, how.
Um,
Go ahead. No, yeah.
yeah, I think Luca made a really good comment in the last episode of Conversations with the Wind, where he said, and these are neighboring countries who have a long history with each other, but he said that he doesn't imagine some kind of epiphany where the Croatians and the Serbians will come together in some kind of grand cultural unity. But what he can envision is a Croatian individual and a Serbian individual working together on a specific project, in the hope of bringing unity and bringing a closer understanding of the two people. So I think that Imperium Art, if you look at it this way, you're going to have a wide variety of cultures represented in Imperium Art. You're going to have the wide variety of opinions and ideologies, and all these things are going to be represented to some extent in Imperium Art. I think that's fine. I think that to me, I look at it as, for example, If you're Polish, then you're focused on working within the thematic of Imperium Art in your country, but then also you want to rise to that existential community in the Imperium where you can interact with someone, say, from the United States to work on a project together. And that collective project that you do with someone from the so that Polish individual does with someone from the United States, elevates it to the Imperium Art level, where then there is an organic understanding of the collective.
Hmm.
International nationalism.
Right.
You know, as he put it to me, it was very charming. He said, "It's like brothers. You know, they
Yeah.
quarrel sometimes, but if you know a bully comes around, then you're gonna stick together real tight." You know, so it's like
Yeah. Yeah.
it's a very natural way to look at it. We're family. We're not always gonna get along, but we're family. And you know, that's something I've been saying over and over: is the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And that, I think, is what's created this entire issue. I mean, if we weren't being attacked from outside, you know, by other foreign interests, then why would we, you know, we would probably just carry on as we are. So, Jim, any thoughts on that?
No, I would only like to add that that conversation you guys had at the last conversation with the win was that one was great, and I'm glad that everyone else was able to take something out of that too.
Hmm. Yeah, I really think we're striving to make excellent quality material and programming for people too. So anybody who's gotten this far in this rather long show here, you know, there's just so much gold to enjoy in all these different shows. So the last point, and then we'll wrap up here, is number 7. I can count, yes. Um, you know, artists and math, anyway. Okay, so address pressing political realities, particularly white genocide, in creative and emotionally convincing ways. Hmm. So, Jim, could you open that up a little bit for us?
Well, I don't really think, as much as I would like to, I don't really think that we could ignore what's going on around us as much as I would want to, and as much as I'm sure everyone else would want to. We, the ultimate goal would still have to be the creation or the formation of sustainable white communities. And if you're in a hostile environment, it's very, very difficult to do that. So I think one of the goals of Imperium Art would have to be to address the hostility of the environment and perhaps inspire people to work against that in positive ways for that ultimate goal, not just to be some sort of martyr or whatever way. It has to be towards this goal of sustainable communities.
Hmm. I feel as if, you know, I've been talking a lot on social media about the riots and this whole scenario, and I've noticed whites don't seem to feel that they're entitled to express grievances about racism towards them as whites, that somehow we're supposed to kneel. And, you know, regardless of the fact that we're far more brutalized by Muslims and Africans and other kinds of people that on a daily basis, you know, at far greater numbers, but somehow we've internalized guilt, and that's just garbage. It's total garbage. So I think maybe that's one thing that Imperium Art can do is sort of boldly express, yeah, these are our grievances, but not. I don't know. I've never been the kind of guy that thinks like offensive art is really useful. I think of it as almost low art, sort of shock jock kind of like. I don't know. I just don't. It's not my style. I don't know. Somebody else could get away with it.
Yeah.
But yeah, but yet at the same time, you know, the number of brutal, just look at South Africa, you know, or I mean even, you know, Denmark, you know, it's, I would say that's like the rape capital of Europe, you know, which with its feminist government. All the people that have died of police brutality that are white, you know, there's just so many things to say. But yeah, I mean, I'm just going on one particular tangent here. I just wanted to reiterate, for me, I keep saying that acknowledgement of white genocide is the cornerstone of imperial art. And whenever I say that, it triggers a lot of people to say, yes, but what about this, that, and the other thing? I agree. There's a lot of other stuff, but that's, I think, what glues this all together.
Um,
Now go ahead.
yeah, what I wanted to, I mean, first of all, I would say that first of all, we need to define what do we mean by white genocide? And I know this is going to sound a little pretentious, but we should not become victims. We should not fall into the trap of
Yeah.
victimization.
Mhm.
We should also be very careful in how we express our grievances. A part of the white genocide is also the low birth rates that we're experiencing all over the Western world. That needs to be addressed. We need more babies. We need
Mhm.
larger families, and we need to express that in our art, how we show through these different points that Jim also brought up and really summarized it excellently, where you have the uh, the ideal of the family and the extended family and the large families. So we really want people to strive towards that because we need to fight this demographic decline. But also with regard to victimization, I'm not a victim, and I refuse to be a victim. And I would rather emulate the Spartans at Thermopylae. I would rather emulate the Croatians and Hungarians fighting at Sigetvar against the Turks or the Ottomans. I would rather emulate these heroes as an example of what it is that I want to achieve. My so our message has to be that yes, we're down. Yes, they've pushed us down, but we're not going to give up. We're going to look up and we're going to say, now it's our turn to punch. And I mean this metaphorically, of course. Um, so so what
In
I what I,
Minecraft, right?
in Minecraft. So what I mean by that is we have to be unapologetic about who we are. And I want to circle back to what I said in the
That
beginning.
comes back to heroism too. I mean, that's
Yeah.
probably the way I would say.
So if somebody, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm just thinking of an example. If somebody starts telling me, you know, you have white privilege, right? I'll look at him and I'll use some expletive. I mean, I don't care. I'll look at him and I'll say, "Go screw yourself." Excuse my French. And I mean because I really don't care what they think is my point. I don't care. I am who I am, and
Mhm.
that's who I'm going to represent, and
Yep.
that's what I care about. All you guys, everything that's going out there, all of this is illegitimate,
Hmm.
and I don't care.
Hmm.
And that's the attitude we have to have.
Hmm.
Because if we don't have this attitude, even because this is a big problem I see with this violence porn that we see all the time. And don't get me wrong, I think that it's good to show these things because it shocks people into realizing what's going on.
Right.
But at the same time, it can also be demoralizing, right? and
Yeah.
and I don't care what these people think. For me, I have my family, I have my nation, I have my people, and that's what I'm fighting for. And we have to be unapologetic about that in our art, in the way we express ourselves, in the way that we tell the world we're here and we're not going anywhere.
Hmm. What do you think, Jim?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that victimization is one of those enlightenment traps that I don't mean like that kind of traps. I mean like one of the snares that can get us caught in its own vice grip. I mean individualism. If you think that everyone else is against you, or you think that you're opposed to everyone else, like atoms bouncing against each other, you're gonna see yourself as a victim. But like what Nels was saying, we're really not. We have communities that are already built,
Right.
and anyone can build a community around them. Like what I was saying in this apartment complex, anyone can build anything if
Hmm.
they want to. But it's like what you were saying, Donald, the demoralization aspect kicks into full gear and people feel like there's nothing they can do. And the Imperium Art should make them feel like there is so much that can be done immediately.
Exactly.
Something I want to add to that as a former middle and high school teacher in urban areas with mostly people of color and Muslims, this is where people do have to get some background research on race realism and also the understanding that these cultures, you're either hustling or being hustled all the time. It's a street culture, it's a culture of cruelty, it's a culture of, where the weakest gets ganged up on and brutalized. And whites are generally kind of nicer, more civilized, more compassionate. So we're always going to be on the bottom of a bunch of feet kicking us if we don't recognize that they are not like us and we are not like them. And the mechanism of the lock and key, so to speak, is that they always win if we don't understand them. So there's a very, very huge empty space there where whites don't get it. They don't, they just think, oh, you're just like me, and well, let's be equal, and yada yada. And they're looking back at us going, ooh, nice, this is great. I can manipulate this person because they're using quote equality and all these other concepts. So that's a bit of an aside, and it would be a whole, like, you could have a series of shows on that. But I do think that ties into moralization, and it could be an interesting theme in art too, especially in, say, a play, where you have people interacting and you see the structures of behaviors in different cultures. High trust cultures versus low trust cultures will always lose. We can't really mix with them in that regard. This is a cultural thing. It's scientifically proven. I challenge anybody, liberal or conservative, to be a teacher in an inner city school for 1 week. And then you'll get it. You will have your quote racial awakening in a very rude way, if you survive. But anyway, I want to thank you, Jim, so very, very, very much for joining us today. This is fantastic. I'm going to put the link to your play, your book, beneath this video. Nullis, amazing insights today. It's always an honor and a pleasure. And
Thank you.
I'm so grateful that we can all kind of work together in this way. And to the audience, thank you for spending your time to be a part of this. Please continue to follow us. Please get involved in the discussion. Make art or share art or be part of the White Art Collective. Do something, get involved. So, thank you again, and have yourself a great evening, everyone. And I'm going to have to edit this because